If you would take out your Bibles and open them up to two places this morning. The first is Genesis chapter 12, and then John chapter 1, and maybe you want to place something to hold your spot for a few moments. It's going to take me a little while to get there, but I promise you I will get there. Now, one of the things that I experience in my job is that I get to hear a lot of stories. And the stories that I hear, they're amazing. Because they're stories of love and heartache, they're stories of searching and purpose, and they're stories of celebration and sadness. And when I get to hear those stories, no matter how different the people who are telling them may be, there's one thing that the stories themselves all have in common. And we will never really understand what our lives are truly about until we understand the context in which our lives are lived. Let me say that another way. See, at some point in life, and I think that this happens to all of us, something's going to happen that's going to cause you to stop and to think. Amidst the busyness of life, as we go about the busyness that comes with each day, there's something inside of us that every once in a while causes us to stop and kind of just poke our heads up and consider the place that we find ourselves in. And when that happens, we start to ask questions like, what's this all about? Where is this going? Is there a purpose to all this? Is this actually going anywhere? Why are we here? Now, the last time I spoke to you about the reliability of the Bible. Who wrote it, how we got it, what makes it different compared to any other book, ancient or modern. And today I want to speak to you again about the Bible, but this time in a very different way. Today I want to tell you the story of the Bible. And the reason I want to do this is because I think that many people in our world view the Bible as just that, just a story. It's a story that's told to us to try to get us to live better lives so that we can be good people. And while that may sound like a good thing, nothing could be further from the truth. See, I think especially for those of us who have grown up in the church, and we've grown up hearing about the stories that are in the Bible. We've grown up hearing about Noah and Samson and Goliath. And in hearing the stories that are in the Bible, many times we miss the story of the Bible. And so today, to the best of my ability, I'm going to tell it to you. And my hope is that at the end of today's message, we will each be in awe of what it is that God has given to us in this book. Because it is this book that gives us the context that we need to understand our lives. And unless we understand the context within which our lives are lived, we will never really understand the purpose that God has for us or why we're here. Because from cover to cover, this book tells one story. It is the story of God's redemptive work in our world, and you are the redeemed. So today I want to tell you the story of the Bible, and I want to do that by giving to you 7 words, 7 simple words that you can easily memorize that give to us an outline of the story of redemption. Now, the first word is the word creation. See, the Bible tells us how everything in our world came into existence. It's an incredible story. And it's a story that may sound like a myth to some people, but all the people who say it's just a myth, they don't really have a better explanation. They just use bigger words to try to explain it. See, here's what happens. The Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth, that God made the first man and the first woman, and He joined them together to create the first family. And in that story, there's two very important points that we often miss. The first is that God made the very first rule, or the first law. Now, God didn't make a whole bunch of rules for this new family. He made one rule. And the reason that God gives this rule, the reason He creates this law, is to establish order and authority in our world. See, without that rule, nobody would know who was actually in charge. And so by giving this one rule, God clearly communicates that He's God and we're not. And when we read that rule, it doesn't even sound like that big of a deal to us. But more important than the rule itself was the fact that God had the authority to establish it. Now, the second thing that we miss in this first story, and this one really gets overlooked, is the fact that God takes everything in the world that He's just created, and He says to the man and to the woman, I'm placing all this under your authority. See, we miss that, but that simple truth explains much of what we experience in our daily lives and what we see in our world. God says to Adam and to Eve, all this that I have just created, I am placing this under your authority. And to get this to really sink in for Adam, God tells Adam to go and to name all the animals, because when you give something a name, it's a sign of ownership. And so God places all of creation under Adam and Eve's authority. And that brings us to our second word, the second chapter of our story, brokenness. See, it's in Genesis chapter 3 that sin enters into our world for the very first time. And this happens because Adam and Eve get into a conflict with God over the one rule that He established. Now, sometimes over the years, I've heard people say things like that rule was somehow unfair, that God was somehow tempting Adam and Eve, or even that this was some kind of entrapment. But see, the rule wasn't really the issue. The real issue was who's going to be in charge? Who is really God? And it's very easy for us to look back on them and think to ourselves, why on earth would they break such a simple rule? But when I think that, then I have to ask myself, why is it that I break God's rules? Why is it that we struggle with right and wrong when we know clearly what is right and what is wrong? See, in the Garden of Eden, when God's rule was broken, then brokenness permeated all of creation. Mankind's relationship with God, broken. Adam and Eve's relationship with one another, broken. Our relationship with the rest of creation, broken. And what Adam and Eve didn't realize was that when they broke their relationship with God, everything under their authority broke. And see, Genesis chapter 3 explains, and I understand it's not the most emotionally satisfying answer, but it is the answer. Genesis chapter 3 explains why all the things that cause you heartache happen. It explains divorce and abuse. It explains illness and pain. It explains loneliness and abandonment. And we are so broken that when those things happen to us or to the people that we care about, who do we blame? God. See, we're so broken, we don't even understand the context of our own brokenness. Then something happens in the story that's really unique. See, in our lives, when things don't go the way that we want them to go, our natural reaction is to start over. When things in life start to cause us pain and frustration, when people hurt us, our natural reaction is to leave and go start over. But that's not what God did. Instead, God starts making promises. That's our third word in the third chapter of our story. And in Genesis chapter 12, we begin to see for the first time the extent of God's incredible love for His creation. Because in the middle of all kinds of chaos, instead of deciding to give up on the ones who caused the brokenness to happen in the first place, God chooses to reveal himself to a man named Abram, who would become Abraham. And he starts making promises to him. And I don't know if I can clearly explain how amazing this really is, but there's absolutely no reason for God to do this. The only thing that was notable about Abraham was how ordinary he was. He was a nomad that lived with his wife and his two brothers and their wives in his father's home. He was 75 years old, and he and his wife were unable to have children. And for some reason, God chooses him and starts making promises to him. And those promises are recorded for us in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now, do you think that it's a coincidence that the three major world religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all trace their roots back to Abraham? That in 2010, nearly 4,000 years after God makes this promise to Abraham, 3.7 billion people who are alive in our world today see Abraham as their spiritual patriarch. See, God really did make his name great. But that's not the only promise that God made to him. Look at the last half of verse 3. "And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." See, as the story continues, we find out that Abraham and his wife Sarah, they're finally able to have a son. And their son Isaac has some children, and one of his sons, Jacob, has 12 children. And because of a very great famine in their own land, this really big family decides to move to Egypt. And this family continues to grow. And finally, in Egypt, there's so many people that are related to Abraham that they almost outnumber the actual Egyptians. And so because of this, the Pharaoh in Egypt decides to make all the descendants of Abraham into slaves. So Abraham did in fact become a nation, but he became a slave nation. And this went on for 100, then 200, then 300. Finally, for 400 years, the nation of Israel existed inside the nation of Egypt as slave labor. And if you had been born in the middle of those 400 years, you would have heard the story of Abraham. And by the time you were 30 or 40 or 50 years old, you would have been like many people in our world today who say, "You know what, I don't believe that. Those stories, they're just myths. God isn't real. We're not a great nation. We're a slave nation." And you could have been born and died in slavery and never seen the fulfillment of that prophecy. And if that was the situation that you were living in, then you would probably become, just like many people in our world have become, very cynical and very suspect of those stories that you had heard ever since you were a little child. Or maybe you would think that those are just a bunch of stories that parents tell to their children to try to get them to be good as they're growing up. But obviously this whole thing, it's just made up because we're slaves.